Today is Sunday, September 12th, Ordinary Time. I entitled it Gandhi and the Caterpillar. You'll know more about the caterpillar later. This gospel reading today is taken from Mark 8, verses 27 and 28, NSV. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. He asked them directly, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Hypocamu, Satane, get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on the divine things, but on human things." He then called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." I love this reading. Jesus had just called his disciples out of their ordinary lives, fisherman, tax collector. After Jesus asked them, "Who do they think he is?" Peter enthusiastically shouts, "You are the Messiah." Then I am quite sure that he, along with the others, was ready to march with Jesus into Jerusalem to overthrow the Roman tyranny and establish the kingdom of God, with those newly proclaimed disciples being exalted along with Jesus. When Jesus rebukes him sternly, "Get behind me, Satan," Peter literally takes a step back. Then Jesus goes on to tell them of the path they need to follow. When he rejects him, he will not only be rejected, but tortured and killed. And they too must lose their lives for his sake in order to gain a new life. If I had been there, I would be sorely tempted to just pick up my own walking stick, turn my back on the others, and return to my small, unpredictable life, tail between my legs. And yet, if we hopefully no longer think that proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah, the Savior, or whatever exultant term first comes to our mind, then going back to our own small life as if our own private ticket to heaven was all we were after, we are sadly mistaken. We have missed the whole point. Probably most of us will not actually become physical martyrs, being imprisoned and dying for proclaiming the message of Jesus. But each one of us is called, just as the early disciples were, not to change the world, which is ultimately and always out of our own control and power, but to change ourselves. Thus, the story of Gandhi and the caterpillar. Here is a picture of the two of them together. Gandhi needs no introduction. Although he was assassinated in 1948, his memory still lives on. Here he is in his Indian loincloth, shoeless and mostly naked, working at his own spinning wheel, making his own clothes from cotton grown in India. He is very thin, a result of the many days of fasting throughout his life, trying to spread his message of nonviolence and unity, eating only vegetables and drinking only water and goat's milk on his journey on earth. Below him, you see, let me introduce Raphael, the caterpillar. Cheryl received him at a women's retreat and said that the wooden caterpillar told her his name was Raphael, meaning God has healed. Since then, this tiny wooden caterpillar has literally wormed his way into both of our hearts. Most biographies and popular mythology have literally canonized Gandhi as a Hindu saint without flaws or character defects. Instead, however, of paying tribute to his memory, I have come to believe that this false narrative does both his memory and us a grave disservice. To get a bit of background for you, Gandhi was born into a high-caste Hindu family in Porbandar, India, in 1869. At that time, India was governed by the British Empire as part of their subject countries extending around the globe. The British were proud to then claim that the sun never set on their empire, as it truly was in so many far-flung places. So the young Gandhi, as a privileged high-class Hindu, went to London to go to school and become a lawyer. Having that degree, he started his own law practice, which first took him to South Africa. He was fittingly dressed like an English gentleman, as this early picture of him shows. Other than his obviously Indian face, he perfectly mimics, with his Eton collar and striped tie, a London gentleman strolling about the House of Lords, a far cry from Gandhi in his later life. And yet, despite Gandhi's obvious success as a lawyer in his early days, he still had a long way to go. In South Africa, where he lived for years, he immediately addressed head-on the widespread discrimination native South Africans had to endure at the hands of the British overlords. He wanted them to be treated as equals. Well, not totally. He wanted some of them, including him, to be treated as equals. You see, then Gandhi still believed in class distinctions, totally in the Hindu understanding of castes, and fully supported the caste system in India and the keeping of the untouchables at the edges of society where they belonged, he still thought. As the young Gandhi would put it, the flower of the British and Indian nations did not deserve to be treated like Asian dirt. He believed that he and his merchant friends were entitled to be treated much better than the native blacks. As he returned to India and began to impel the British to change their racial policies, initially he was there too, just fighting for a place at the lavish British table, leaving the great majority of Indians to be excluded, especially the untouchables. Yet to get this for Indians still under racist British apartheid, he had made both a tactical and more deeply a spiritual decision that the confrontation with the British authorities needed to rise to another level, that of ahimsa, nonviolence. This led to a series of confrontations with the British tanks and guns. With their arms outraised, the Indians would march one by one to the British soldiers who would ruthlessly knock them over like bowling pins. As the strikes and protests and attempts at negotiation went on, Gandhi ultimately realized that the British really were not the benign and needed overlords he had believed in for so long and tried to emulate, the one he had seen through his rose-colored glasses, but that India had to break free of them completely and take the future into their own hands. The three barriers to this were, first, that very few of his followers really deeply understood or practiced ahimsa, nonviolence, but resorted ultimately to brute force. Second, that India had to come to grips with its own taboo-laden and very rigid caste system. Third, Hindus, by far the majority, and Muslims had to learn to live peacefully together. All of that never happened. The violence between the British and Indians escalated. An outright war broke out over India, all between the Hindus and the Muslims, hundreds of thousands being slaughtered by each other and butchered even by their erstwhile neighbors, with literally millions having to flee their own homes and towns to avoid the massacres. Some of his last words before he was assassinated were, "I am groping for the light, but I'm surrounded by darkness. I don't want to die a failure, but as a successful man. But it may be that I am a failure." In the days immediately following his assassination, before his assassination, he would set out every early morning, bamboo staff in hand, visiting villages torn apart by the sectarian warfare, singing to himself a poem by Tagore, "Walk alone. If they answer not thy call, walk alone. If they are afraid and cower mutely, facing the wall, O thou of evil luck, open thy mind and speak out alone. If they turn away and desert you when crossing the wilderness, O thou of evil luck, trample the thorns under thy tread, and along the blood-soaked track, walk alone." So ultimately, he was left alone, along his own blood-soaked path. His beloved and always supportive wife, Kasturbai, having died years earlier, most of his disciples either dying or abandoning him with his spinning wheel, simply working and continuing to spin out his own life. This ultimate failure, perhaps, can be shown in the so-called evolution of the Indian national flag. To the left, as you can see here, the one Gandhi designed in the 1930s when India was still fighting for its independence, is a representation of his spinning wheel, declaring that India would only be free when it returned to its pastoral agrarian roots, a simpler, more spiritual life, and literally would spin out its own thread in each and every home. And yet to the right, you see the one finally officially adopted when India actually became free in 1948. The spinning wheel has Ashoka's. It is ironic that while his message of nonviolence did not ultimately succeed in India, his ideas were the seeds of the peaceful revolution Nelson Mandela led in South Africa to free them from British and Dutch colonization. Yet later, his ideas spurred Martin Luther King to do the same in the United States, leading to the Voting Rights Act. So I still admire Gandhi. He tried mightily and valiantly through beatings, prison, hunger strikes, and even despair to do justice, to confront his own racism and classism, to continue to claim nonviolence and returning to an agrarian past were worth fighting and even dying for. Yet even with some of his failures, I discovered, he is perhaps a too lofty goal for me. This is where Raphael, the caterpillar, comes in again. I must admit he's more my speed, waking up every day, more often than not plodding through my day. If you look closely at Raphael from this new angle, you may see that his right rear leg is missing. My belief is that he was attacked by a barn swallow, and luckily for his story, he escaped only by losing a leg. But he can crawl, limping a bit, perhaps a bit lopsidedly. He thinks that his life is overall good, with the possible exception of the swallow attack, and curls up every night into a warm, contented, fuzzy ball. And little does he know, as most or all of us know, that we are, each and one of us, destined for greater things. So as the autumn drew near, and the leaves that fed him were beginning to curl up and fall, he became more and more tired, finally falling asleep. Maybe in his dreams he dreamt of something more, but he never daydreamed that. With or without his waking knowledge, he was destined to become a butterfly. So as we end, here is a time-lapse photo of one of his living cousins going through that unconscious transformation into a butterfly. Notice as the web continues to wrap around him from his rear end to his mouth, he keeps unconsciously, contentedly munching on the last leaves of summer. Accompanying this will be a poem and lyrics by Kim Rosen, In Impossible Darkness.
Do you know how the caterpillar turns? Do you remember what happens inside a cocoon? You liquefy. There, in the thick black of your self-spun womb, void as the moon before waxing, you melt as Christ did for 3 days in the tomb, conceiving in impossible darkness, the sheer inevitability of wing.
So to pull this thread together into its finished product, Gandhi had to go through much transformation in his life to become the spiritual leader he was. It was symbolized by the spinning wheel he spent hours on every day, turning the raw cotton into thread. To be truthful, Raphael the caterpillar is, still out in the garden, munching hungrily on the last leaves as they fall around him, awaiting his falling asleep for a long, unconscious winter, safely wrapped in his cocoon, not even remotely realizing that his destiny the following spring was to become a beautiful butterfly. But I truly believe the last words in the impossible darkness, we are all, like Peter and the other hesitant and fearful early disciples, called to be all we can be, to trust in the process of our letting go, to trust that our emerging wings will take us everywhere we want to go. As you reflect on your own wings, let us end with the actual emergence of the new butterfly with its wet and untried wings. I wonder where it will take us.